Hello, and thanks for stopping by. Due to its current incarnation, it can be rather tricky, especially if you're in a rush for a train, to appreciate just how historic Euston Station is. The building we see today is relatively modern, a product of the 1960s, which, in an attempt to compete with jet travel, was designed, in part, to resemble an airport terminal. To achieve this look though, its historic predecessor, the first Euston, which had been established by the London and Birmingham Railway in the 1830s as part of the capital's first railway link with another city, had to be swept away, including, in 1962, the controversial demolition of the Euston Arch, which once held pride of place over the main entrance. If it's hard to recall that history, then it's nigh on impossible to appreciate that, in 1808, 29 years before the first Euston was even a glimmer in London's eye, a very important piece of early railway history existed close to where the terminal now stands. That being the wonderfully named Steam Circus. And so in this video, I'd like to share the story of what the Steam Circus was, who was behind it, and how it came to be. I'll even throw in a steam-powered bus, for good measure too. The fellow at the centre of this tale is Richard Trevithick, a genius engineer and inventor who had experienced many ups and downs in his life. One of 6 children, Richard was born on the 13th of April 1771 in Cornwall, in the hamlet of Tregeruren, pardon my pronunciation, close to the town of Redruth. As a youngster, he attended the village school in nearby Camborne, where, in a damning report, one of his schoolmasters famously described him as being disobedient, slow, and obstinate, as well as being frequently absent and very inattentive. Nevertheless, Richard demonstrated an exceptional grasp of arithmetic, and he also excelled at sport. In his prime, he stood at 6 foot 2 inches tall, a very impressive stature for the late 18th century, and, possessing brawn as well as brains, he would go on to become a champion Cornish wrestler. During this era, tin and copper mining were a major industry in Cornwall, and it was a profession that was in the Trevithick's blood. Richard's father, also called Richard, worked as a mine captain, and his mother, Anne, was the daughter of a miner. It was therefore a given that young Richard Trevithick would also find employment in mining, and so in 1790 he commenced his career at the Stray Park mine in Camborne. By the 1700s, rudimentary steam devices were already in use. The first commercial steam pump, for example, known as the Savery engine, after its Devonshire inventor Thomas Savery, had been demonstrated at the Royal Society in London in 1699, and by 1776, vastly improved steam engines, masterminded by the Scottish engineer James Watt, were entering commercial use. These early engines were used heavily in mining, and as a child, Richard Trevithick had enjoyed watching them crank away as they pumped water out of the pits, leading him to develop a fascination with the power of steam. In 1797, Richard married Jane Harvey, and in that same year, he began working at the wonderfully named Ding Dong mine, where he was employed as an engineer. Although many Cornish mines used steam pumps, the area was devoid of the coal required to fire them. This meant the fuel had to be shipped in from other parts of the country, which of course proved expensive. Because of the high cost involved in operating them, it was vital then that Cornish steam pumps ran as efficiently as possible, and it was to the matter of improving this that Richard Trevithick turned his attention. As groundbreaking as they were, the types of engine designed by James Watt were large and cumbersome. They also operated at low pressures, as Watt believed using higher pressures was potentially dangerous. Richard Trevithick, however, figured that harnessing high-pressure steam, which by this point he believed could be made safe, would not only make engines more powerful, but also enable them to be made lighter and more compact. And so, in conjunction with fellow engineer Edward Bull, he began tweaking Watt's design to achieve this end. A roughly modern analogy perhaps would be to consider the way in which older computers from the 1950s and 60s, which used to fill entire rooms, were eventually shrunk down to the small but vastly more powerful machines we know today. This push for high pressure engines didn't go down at all well with James Watts though. He angrily declared that the young upstart, Richard Trevithick, quote, deserved hanging for daring to unleash a potentially explosive force upon the public. By reducing the size of steam engines, Richard Trevithick reasoned they could also be made mobile and thus adapted to power modes of transport. And so, at the turn of the 19th century, he constructed a roadworthy steam-powered vehicle, which he christened Puffing Devil, a machine that was essentially a very early type of traction engine. The Puffing Devil was first put through its paces on Christmas Eve 1801, when Richard drove the hissing, clattering machine through the streets of Camborne, with 6 passengers clinging, no doubt for dear life, to the sides. The footage seen here shows a reconstruction of the vehicle being demonstrated in Camborne in 2017, on the town's annual Trevithick Day. Further runs were conducted over the next few days, although on the 27th of December, the engine conked out. Undeterred, Richard and his friends popped to the pub for a few drinks and a roast goose dinner, and as they tucked into their meal, they allowed the fire in the boiler of the Puffing Devil, which was parked undercover nearby, to keep blazing away. Consequently, the engine overheated, leaving it burnt out beyond repair. Although Richard was happy to admit that this was his own fault, rather than an error with the design. In 1802, Richard Trevithick built an early steam locomotive designed to run on rails for the Coalbrookdale Company near Ironbridge in Shropshire, although little is known about the extent to which it was used. Then, the following year, he and his family moved to London. Following his experiments with the Puffing Devil, Richard had been able to improve upon the design, and he now had a bolder vision for a steam-driven vehicle, that being the London Steam Carriage, a revolutionary design which sought to replace the horse-drawn omnibus. As you can see from this illustration, the London Steam Carriage was kitted out with massive rear wheels, the idea being that this would provide a better grip when traversing rough roads. A number of gears were incorporated too, and the boiler was forged from wrought iron. The steam bus was assembled at Felton's carriage shop on Leather Lane, close to Hatton Garden in Clerkenwell, the site of which is now marked with a plaque. This contraption, which in my opinion looks just a little hair-raising, made several successful trips through the capital, the first being when Richard's cousin, Andrew Vivian, drove it from Leather Lane, up to Lord's Cricket Ground, down to Paddington, and then back to the workshop via Islington, a journey of a good few miles, and quite a feat for such a new piece of technology. The carriage itself was designed to carry 8 to 10 people, and again from the illustration, we can see the main body was perched high above the ground. It sat on a set of suspension springs, and according to some who rode it, it was pretty uncomfortable, very bouncy I'd imagine. This opinion was perhaps best summed up by another relative, John Vivian, who happened to be a ship's captain. When he was in London, John took a ride with Richard and Andrew on the steam bus, although when offered a repeat journey the following day, he politely declined, claiming he was, quote, more likely to suffer shipwreck on the steam carriage rather than on board his vessel. Further test drives were made along Tottenham Court Road and towards Euston Square, with the group often setting out at around 4 AM when the roads were deserted, and on one occasion, when things were going particularly well, with the vehicle speeding along at 10 miles per hour, Richard joked that they should drive the carriage all the way back to Cornwall. On another occasion, the London steam bus was permitted to motor along Oxford Street, with all other traffic being held back to permit its safe passage. People were waving handkerchiefs from the houses, recalled one eyewitness some years later. The carriage moved along very quickly, and there was great cheering. However, on another early morning trip, whilst clattering along at a hair-raising 6 miles per hour, the carriage pitched out of control, leading it to crash into a fence outside a house and tear down a length of railings before it hissed to a halt. Unsurprisingly, the unfortunate resident of the house who'd been so rudely awoken darted his head out of a window and angrily demanded, "What the devil are you doing there? What the devil is that thing?" Well, I suppose you can't blame him really, can you? It could be said that, technically, this incident marks the first ever accident of a mechanically driven vehicle in Britain, if not the world, and although nobody was hurt, it did mar the reputation of the fledgling steam bus somewhat. This, coupled with the fact that the vehicle was very expensive to maintain, led to the projects being wound down, and the various parts were sold off. Richard Trevithick's experiments with the Puffing Devil and London Steam Carriage led him to conclude that roads, especially the rough and unpaved streets of that era, were not suited for steam traction, and as his son would later describe, a smooth road of iron was going to be the best way of enabling the steam horse to run well. It would not take Richard long to put this theory to the test. In the autumn of 1803, he was approached by a fellow named Samuel Homfray, who owned an ironworks in Penydarren, close to Merthyr Tydfil in Wales. The two men already knew each other. In 1802, Trevithick had built a stationary, high-pressure engine at the ironworks, and Samuel now had a new proposal for him. Over the past few years, a 9-mile-long tramroad had been laid from the Penydarren works towards the Merthyr-Cardiff Canal. Such tracks were nothing new, as rails, or wagonways as they were known then, had been in use in some form or another for many years, although the trucks that ran on them were of course horse-drawn. Knowing Richard had been working on steam-powered road vehicles, Samuel wondered whether such designs could be applied to the tramway, this of course coinciding with Richard's own recent thoughts. Richard therefore immediately set to work on building a custom-made engine to run on the Welsh track, completing what was the world's first full-scale working railway engine just a few months later in February 1804. The Penydarren locomotive commenced its first run on the 21st of February, which Trevithick described in his own words. "Yesterday we proceeded on our journey with the engine, and we carried 10 tons of iron in 5 wagons, and 70 men riding on the whole journey. The engine, while working, went nearly 5 miles an hour." The reference to the men riding along is an important one, as this marks the first ever time a self-propelled engine operating on rails had carried passengers. Ultimately, however, the locomotive would prove too heavy for the rails, and it was later converted to a stationary engine for the ironworks. Nevertheless, the journey from Merthyr Tydfil marked a landmark in the development of railway travel, and would later pave the way for Richard's next railway innovation. In the summer of 1808, Richard Trevithick unveiled a new railway engine, this time in London, a locomotive named Catch Me If You Can, which had been given its cheeky name by the sister of Richard's friend and fellow Cornish engineer, Davis Gilbert, who was affectionately known as Mr. Giddy. This time, in a manner similar to his previous steam bus, Richard wanted to demonstrate the possibilities of applying the power of steam to passenger transportation, and so, at great cost to himself, he hired a patch of open land a few moments south of where Euston Station now stands, an area that was located approximately here, parallel to Gower Street and roughly where University College's Chadwick building is now located. This plaque on Gower Street marks the spot. Here Richard constructed a short loop of track, around 100 foot long, London's very first circle line if you will, and he enclosed it with a tall fence. In hindsight, this may have been a mistake, as the innovation was worthy of being shared with as many people as possible. If you wanted to see what newfangled invention lurked behind the barrier, the entry fee was 1 shilling, about £3 in today's money, which, as one person who visited it said, included a ride in a carriage pulled by Catch Me If You Can for those who were not too timid. As you can see from this picture, the carriage looked nothing like what railway cars would eventually evolve into. In this case, it was pretty much the same as an open-top horse buggy. But don't forget, this little railway ran in 1808, the very same year in which Beethoven composed his Fifth Symphony. Richard called this setup the Steam Circus, and a letter written by him to Mr. Giddy, dated the 28th of July 1808, provides us with a rare insight into it. About 4 or 5 days ago, I tried the engine, which worked exceedingly well, but the ground was very soft, and the engine, about 8 tons, sank the timber under the rails and broke a great number of them. Following this incident, the rails were relaid, but it would appear again the engine proved too heavy for them. An eyewitness account of the Steam Circus was later written by the civil engineer John Isaac Hawkins, who took a ride around the circuit. "I rode with my watch in my hand," he recalled, "at the rate of 12 miles per hour. Mr. Trevithick then gave his opinion that it would do 20 miles an hour or more on a straight railway." It's believed the Steam Circus remained open for around 2 to 3 months, although unfortunately, as with the earlier London Steam Bus, the costs involved were too high for Richard to bear, and he was also apparently, and unbelievably in hindsight, disheartened at the response to his demonstrations. As such, the Steam Circus was packed up, and it would be some years until that other great railway engineer, George Stephenson, picked up the mantle and took steam travel to new heights. Nevertheless, the Steam Circus that ran on this little patch of ground near present-day Euston represented the first time in history in which the public were able to purchase tickets to ride on a self-propelled railway. Some months before Richard Trevithick began promoting his Steam Circus near Euston, he'd also been employed by the Thames Archway Company to work as a consultant on the creation of a tunnel beneath the Thames between Rotherhithe and Limehouse, both areas of London where Richard had spent time living with his family. However, in January 1808, after forging a pilot tunnel which stretched 905 feet, the river burst through, with Richard narrowly avoiding death in a deluge. In the wake of this, relations with the Thames Archway Company deteriorated, and the project was abandoned. The first Thames tunnel, of course, would eventually be completed by Mark and Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the latter also narrowly avoiding drowning in a similar accident. Richard Trevithick then went on to create various designs related to boats and shipping, and after suffering bankruptcy, he decided to try his luck in South and Central America, specifically Peru and Costa Rica. Richard would spend a whole decade away from England, and upon his return, he barely had a penny to his name. As such, and considering the contribution he'd made towards Britain's industry, a petition was sent to the House of Commons requesting Richard to be granted a government pension. Sadly, the notion was rejected. Richard Trevithick struggled on, and eventually, in 1831, he managed to secure work in Dartford, where he was contracted by J&E Hull to work on a new design of engine for a ship they were constructing. Whilst employed in Dartford, Richard resided at the Bull Hotel, which is now known as the Royal Victoria and Bull Hotel. The Bull was his home for well over a year, and sadly, it was also the place where his life would come to an end. After contracting pneumonia, Richard was confined to his bed for a week. No friends or relatives came to his bedside though, meaning when the time came, on the morning of the 22nd of April 1833, he was completely alone when he died. A tragic end for a man of such historic importance. By this point, Richard was absolutely penniless, although fortunately his workmates at J&E Hull clubbed together to arrange a basic funeral for him. They also paid a night watchman to guard his body against body snatchers, and acted as pallbearers when Richard was laid to rest at St Edmund's burial ground on top of Dartford's East Hill. Despite the respect and kindness shown by his workmates, they couldn't afford a headstone, meaning Richard's grave lay unmarked. Then, when St Edmund's closed in 1857, the location of his final resting place was lost altogether. Some attempt to rectify this was made in the 1950s, when this plaque was placed close to where Richard Trevithick's grave is believed to have been. The final word of this story is perhaps best left to Richard himself, who wrote these lines towards the end of his life. I have been branded with folly and madness for attempting what the world calls impossibilities, but I shall be satisfied by the great, secret pleasure and laudable pride that I feel in my own breast, from having been the instrument of bringing forward and maturing new principles and new arrangements of boundless value to my country. However much I may be straitened in pecuniary circumstances, the great honour of being a useful subject can never be taken from me, which to me far exceeds riches. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look at the life of Richard Trevithick, and would love to hear your own thoughts on this great man. How important do you think he was in the development of railway travel? And would you have chanced to ride on his London Steam bus? Please be sure to let me know in the comments. Thank you so much to all of you who support my channel with your kind words, likes and shares. I couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course it would be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.